So in terms of user management, when we talk about user management, it's like defining what kind of access and permission levels that we give to users. So as we saw earlier on, the files will be assigned to users because these files belong to some account, and those accounts are what we're referring to as users. And so every user is technically an account by someone, and these accounts will have their files and their permissions. Now we have different types of categories, and we will have like 3 different categories of users. So in this lesson, we're going to be looking at, first of all, user management, group management, and then the user permissions. So the first thing we want to talk about is what are users. So as I mentioned earlier on, when we talk about user management in general, we're talking about how access is given to users. But when we talk about a user or an account, we're referring to some kind of logical identity of an entity. It's a bit tricky, but when we talk about an identity, it's just like an ID, an image that we give to someone, or a tag that is associated to a particular entity. And that entity could be a human being, it could be a group of people, it could also be a system. So user accounts are not limited to human beings. They can also be systems as well, or even softwares. Now, we have 3 different categories of users. And these categories, the first category, which is just one user, is the super user. So the super user is sometimes referred to as the root user. That's kind of that user that has, we'll say, total control of the system. And so every Linux system will have one super user, which is also referred to as the root user. We also have the normal user. The normal user will be any other user that is created on the system. So basically, when we talk about any other user, you can create maybe user 1, user 2, maybe user 3. From our previous lesson, we noticed that there was some kind of user called OS boxes. And the OS boxes user is a typical example of what we refer to as a normal user. We also have what we refer to as the service user. The service user may be assigned to softwares. So basically, if the Linux system is running a particular server, maybe a web server or a database server. When we talk about service user, anytime you start a server on a Linux system, it automatically creates a user. The reason is that it wants to be able to isolate every system from each other. So users are different from, say, the systems. And so we can give permissions to a file or a user. At the same time, we can give permission to a service. So we can say this service cannot be, say, executed. This service cannot be done by this person. So everything is seen as a user, or everything is seen as a file. And for that reason, we can assign permissions and also some kind of access to these things. So we have 3 main users: the super user, which is like the root user; normal users are the standard users; and then the service user is just servers. So database server, whatever. Once you start it, it automatically creates a user, and that user is more like the identity for the service. So yes, the super user is also referred to as the root user, as I mentioned. With the super user has total control over the system. So they can do everything. They can create users. They can also delete users. They have control. And the advice I'll give to anyone who is handling the super user account, or who is managing some Linux infrastructure, is that never use the super user unless you have to. Normally, you would have to create another user and then give that user some permissions to be able to execute certain tasks. But make sure that the super user is not known by multiple people. Otherwise, there's no point having a super user. So as I mentioned, you should be careful who is having that user. Sometimes normal users can also assume the role of a super user by using the keyword sudo. So anytime you try to do a command and it doesn't work, and it's because maybe at that particular point in time, you don't have permission to do that. But temporarily, if you want to use it, you can assume that role by saying sudo. So when you use the sudo command, basically you're trying to say that you want to be in that position to be a super user. So technically you're saying that you're doing what a super user can do. So that's what sudo is doing. So assuming you're a normal user, you can still assume the role of a super user.